Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Fair play for joining me on today, which is arguably one of the nicest days of the year in Ireland. And I presume the same in the UK and Canada if you guys are tuned in as well, because we have some patients in the UK and Canada. My name is Andy Shepherd. I'm the clinical lead here at ReadyCare. And today we're going to be talking about, how to reduce your snoring. So let's get started. Okay, at the very root cause of many chronic diseases, and we've spoken about this quite a bit in the podcast, is something known as insulin resistance. And this is all too relevant when it comes to snoring as well. So, worth re examining what insulin resistance is. Insulin resistance is when your body produces insulin, which is a hormone produced by the pancreas. Over time, it kind of becomes resistant to the action of insulin. So, basically, what happens is the pancreas kind of breaks, it kind of malfunctions a little bit, and it produces too much insulin. And then you become what's known as insulin resistant. So, a very good friend of mine and someone who works with us at ReadyCare, Dr. Donald Collins, describes this really well by saying, if you put white noise on in the background, that kind of sound on the radio, it's very annoying. It interferes in everything, you can't concentrate. But if you leave it on at a low level for long enough, you kind of miss it when you switch it off. And the same thing happens with insulin. When the body's producing way too much insulin, which is driven predominantly by overconsumption of processed refined carbohydrates and sugars, the pancreas kind of breaks. You get dysfunction of the pancreas. And what happens is, instead of making too little insulin, the body goes into overdrive, makes loads and loads and loads and loads of insulin. So the pancreas and the liver are driving most of this. And this goes on to cause, well, we know it for sure causes type 2 diabetes. It drives weight through something known as de novo lipogenesis, which is a fancy way of saying new fat storage, is driven mostly by insulin, that hormone, from, again, carbohydrate and sugar. Cholesterol levels will see your good cholesterol going down, your HDL, and your triglycerides going up. They're fats in the blood. High blood pressure through something known as endothelin 1 and nitric oxide. And then Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, polycystic ovarian syndrome, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and sleep apnea. Now, we're not necessarily talking about sleep apnea today, but there's a massive overlap between snoring and sleep apnea. You always snore when you have sleep apnea, and snoring is a precursor for developing sleep apnea. So snoring is essentially the kind of vibrating of the tissue in the upper airway, the trachea. And that happens because the main driver of this is actually fat storage in the back pad of the tongue. So the same thing is seen with sleep apnea. Sleep apnea, which is a more severe form of snoring, which completely occludes the airway and stops you breathing multiple times per night, and goes on to have a whole host of side effects, everything from and risks that it presents to you, including heart disease, more likely to be diabetic, have cancer, and so on and so forth. And it's a vicious cycle, because the less sleep you get, the less well your body regulates sugar, and so on. And you end up with sugar cravings, poor sleep, which causes more sugar cravings and more poor sleep. So it's a real vicious cycle. So snoring happens when you have just a small gap as the tongue relaxes and falls back into the airway. There's not enough of a gap. The reason there's not enough of a gap is, if you look at the yellow here on the left, this is somebody who's the same weight as the person on the right, almost identical BMI, 35 and 34.2, very, very close. But the person on the left is insulin resistant. The person on the right is not. So basically, the person on the left has high blood sugar levels, high insulin levels. And what happens is, your body starts to inappropriately store fat in the back pad of the tongue as you become insulin resistant. So it's a little bit sciencey, but it's worth looking at because it's really, really interesting. We can actually explain now with a lot of confidence, from looking at the clinical literature, how non-alcoholic fatty liver disease happens, how we see visceral adiposity, where you get that pot belly and spare tire around the midsection, a buildup of fat in the heart known as myocardial fat buildup, a fatty pancreas, and OSA, which is obstructive sleep apnea. There's a couple of different types of sleep apnea. You have CSA, which is central sleep apnea, which is more neurological. It's rooted more in kind of brain dysfunction as opposed to metabolic dysfunction. So this happens when you become insulin resistant. So think of insulin resistance as your pancreas is tired. Your pancreas is the hormone that, the organ that makes that hormone insulin. So when your pancreas is tired, it's not making insulin appropriately. In fact, it's making too much, and your body becomes resistant to the action of insulin. Now, the problem with this is, every time you eat carbohydrate or sugar, your body can't deal with it appropriately. And what it does, instead of producing the correct amount of insulin that drives the glucose into the cells where they can be used for energy at an appropriate level, it doesn't do that. And what it does is, it converts the glucose into what are known as triglycerides, which are fats, and it shoves them into internal organs, around internal organs, into the heart, into the pancreas, and into the tongue. And this is why we tend to see these kind of what are known as metabolic syndrome type manifestations of high insulin levels. So if you look, for example, at somebody who's type 2 diabetic, because we know they have high blood sugar levels, you will tend to see almost every time fatty liver and very, very often visceral adiposity and very, very often sleep apnea. So, and this kind of, it kind of frustrates me a little bit when we do this whole, well, sleep apnea is associated with obesity, and obesity is associated with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And having weight around the midsection makes you more likely to be diabetic. And no, very few people are actually saying, well, actually, they have a common underlying mechanism, and that mechanism is hyperinsulinemia, high levels of insulin. So the tongue fat, the buildup in tongue fat is more to do with high blood sugar levels and high insulin levels from the food you eat, the carbohydrate and sugar, than it is to do with weight, if that makes sense. So often we say, well, if you're overweight, that's what causes the snoring. And that's technically not true, because there's a body type that is known as TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. It tends to be seen more in Asian and BAME type communities, where if you have, you might have a little bit of a pot belly, the fat storage in the tongue, fatty liver, but you don't really have any weight. So I've treated sleep apnea patients and type 2 diabetic patients who were 8.5 stone, 9 stone, slight little pot belly, usually just below the belly button as opposed to above it. So you don't necessarily have to be overweight to snore, but they tend to go hand in hand. So people will give you extremely insightful advice, like if you lose a couple of stone, it might help your snoring. But it's not actually the weight loss around the midsection that drives a reduction in snoring. It's the reduction in tongue fat. And we see this in obstructive sleep apnea as well. The conclusion of a recent paper here done a couple of years ago was that the weight loss reduced the volumes of the several upper airway soft tissue. So that basically the main driver of the improvements in sleep apnea, which is essentially the same thing as snoring, it's snoring gone a bit more severe, was actually the reduction in the tongue fat. So they looked at this and they looked at, they allowed for the amount of weight that was lost across all the participants. And they said, well, it wasn't the weight loss, because some people who lost 15 kgs had much smaller improvements in their sleep apnea compared to other patients who lost 5 kgs. So it wasn't the weight loss. So let's allow for that factor. Let's take weight loss out of it. What was the main driver? And really cleverly, they scanned all their tongues. They did kind of MRI type scans on the tongues. They showed the fat deposition and buildup. And patients who had bigger reductions in tongue fat, that was the main driver of the reduction in snoring and sleep apnea. So the reason this is relevant is because if you want to reduce that's the study if anyone is interested in it. If you want to reduce your snoring, don't look to lose a lot of weight necessarily. If you have weight to lose, then lose the weight. Now, this is really important. There are some ways that will cause a lot of weight loss that you can do. You can do caloric restriction, intermittent fasting. But the main thing that will help your snoring and reduce that back pad storage, fat storage in the back pad of the tongue, is a lower carbohydrate diet. So a lower carbohydrate diet more effectively treats, or a ketogenic diet with intermittent fasting, all of those approaches will lower your blood sugar levels. They will lower that hormone we were talking about, which is insulin. And when insulin goes down, you resolve insulin resistance, and all of that carbohydrate metabolism dysfunction that's going on in the background begins to resolve slowly. So it's not unusual for patients to say to me, I say slowly, but actually sometimes 2, 3, 4 weeks in, they might say to me, I don't know, is this a coincidence, but my wife has said I've stopped snoring in the last couple of weeks. And they haven't lost a huge amount of weight. They might have lost 5 or 6 pounds and the snoring stopped straight away. So that's not all that uncommon. So if you're looking to reduce your snoring, focus on the things that will reduce your blood sugar levels, which in turn will reduce your insulin levels, which in turn will stop your body inappropriately storing fat in the back pad of the tongue, your liver, and various different organs like your pancreas and your heart. And the way to do that is to eat single ingredient foods. Now, there are some exceptions to this rule, but it's a very good rule. I often say to my patients, if you want to keep it really simple, shop around the outskirts in a supermarket. So picture your average supermarket you go into and shop around the outskirts. If you shop around the outskirts, you're going to have your full fat dairy. There will be low fat, but full fat is better. Full fat dairy, meat, eggs, butter, cheese. You're going to have your fish counters, fruits, vegetables, all that sort of stuff. The only exception to the single ingredient foods, and they are all single ingredient foods, are things like potatoes and tropical fruits. So potatoes and vegetables that grow below the ground and tropical fruits like bananas, grapes, and so on are particularly harmful for that fat storage in the tongue and the liver because of the way that fructose, which is a fruit sugar, is metabolized. So it goes directly into the liver and kind of packs up the liver and other internal organs as it spills out. So I would avoid those tropical fruits. I would go for all the other fruits, particularly strawberries, raspberries, and blackberries, which are high in vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and fiber, but relatively lower in that fruit sugar fiber that causes the liver issues. So shop around the outskirts, and then the foods that you want to eat less of are the ones that we know spike your blood sugar levels. So the breads, cereals, granola bars, frozen pizzas, scones, potatoes, the stuff actually that if you're in Ireland, our whole country revolves around. The UK is pretty similar, and Canada not too far off the mark either, which goes a lot of the way to explaining why we see so much metabolic disease. So we've moved away from eating these single ingredient whole foods that your grandparents would have recognized and that our ancestors would have thrived and survived on and evolved eating, and so did we. And there's a mismatch between the high degree of processed refined foods and sugars that we have coming into the diet and our human physiology. And this is why we get that carbohydrate metabolism dysfunction that goes on to lead to things like snoring, polycystic ovarian syndrome, high blood pressure, obesity, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, some forms of cancer, and so on. So hopefully that's given you a good sort of a snapshot of how to approach the snoring side of things. Reduce your overall carbohydrate, particularly refined carbohydrate intake. Eat less sugary type foods. Eat more unprocessed food. So I always use the acronym MEALS, and it stands for M is for meat or fish, E stands for eggs, A is for added fats, L is for low sugar fruits and vegetables, and S is just an easy one to remember for snack. Snack on, now you don't have to snack, snacking is not good for you. Snack on dark chocolate, nuts, cheese, boiled eggs, real food. So basically take a real food, single ingredient approach, focusing on reducing overall processed carbohydrate. Do a bit of exercise, intermittent fasting, and then don't be surprised if your snoring stops in the next couple of weeks. Guys, any questions, reach out for us. Thanks a million for joining us again today. Enjoy the weather, but be careful in it. Make sure to click subscribe over here. Click the bell notification over here so you get a notification every time we go live. I appreciate you being with me. Have a good day and enjoy it. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.